Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. Great to see all of you today. So glad that you're here with us this morning. This is one of those mornings that I am wound up, excited, ready to get into this class and couldn't wait all week long. I've been looking forward to it. So I'm glad you're here today. I'm glad that we can get started, and we're going to jump right into it here this morning as we put a wrap on the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk. I've had several people in here that have texted me, emailed me, talked to me, and talked about how they have been on the verge of absolute collapse and depression in the last 2 weeks as we've been studying through this book. And I told you from the beginning it's heavy. I said from the beginning it's going to be some tough sledding for a little bit, but I promised you from day one that there was going to be some optimism in this. And so I'm so excited that today we can finally relieve a little of that tension. We can bring about a little bit of a good news. I've said that there was a light at the end of the tunnel that wasn't necessarily an oncoming train, and so today we're going to be able to see what that is. The interesting thing about that is the light at the end of the tunnel for this book doesn't come in this book. If we don't know anything beyond this story from what we read in this book, it looks dismal. It starts dismal, it ends dismal, it's dismal all the way through. The good news is we have other books. The good news is we have the scope of history. The good news is we understand the big picture. And in understanding the big picture, we can find even in this really, really dark book some wonderful things to be excited about. I'm going to start this morning with a story. This is one of my favorite stories. I don't think I've told this story here. If I have, just pretend and smile. But I don't think I have. And this story revolves around three people. Three of the most remarkably unrelated people that you could possibly imagine, whose lives became so intertwined that it's absolutely nothing short of a complete God thing. The first one is a man named, I always say his name wrong, Mitsuo Fuchida. Mitsuo Fuchida. It might be that Fuchida is a name that some of you might recognize. He's better known as Admiral Fuchida. Admiral Fuchida in World War II had distinguished himself as a fighter pilot, bomber pilot in the Japanese-Chinese War starting in 1938. And by 1940, he had risen up to the ranks, and he was the foremost expert on military strategy regarding Navy aviation in the Japanese Navy. It was his job to plan and carry out Pearl Harbor. And he did so with incredible aplomb. If you are familiar at all with this phrase, he was the one who, through his radio, called Tora, 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 which was the code word, Tiger, 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 which let the aircraft carriers know that the American fleet had been caught completely by surprise. He was the first bombs, his were the first bombs dropped. He was the architect and was an incredible mastermind and masterful pilot. Fuchida, after that, went on to carry himself with distinction through many, many other battles through World War II. He was injured, ironically, not in the air. He was injured on the ship and missed out on the Battle of Midway, but he was relegated to some office duties. The end of the war comes, and Fuchida, because of his place with Pearl Harbor, is being tried for war crimes in Kyoto, Japan, just outside of Tokyo. We'll pick his story up again in just a second. Second story. Her name is Peggy Covell. Peggy Covell was born in the United States to a deeply Christian family. When Peggy was very young, her mom and dad decided to move Peggy and the two sisters, brother and sister, as missionaries to Japan. And so Peggy Covell and her family went to Japan, and they established a church. They evangelized to the Japanese people. All of the children and both parents were bilingual, and they served for years and years and years and years until it got up to about 1939. Tensions obviously are starting to ramp up in Japan against Westerners because of all the problems that are going on with embargoes and trade regulations that the United States is placing on them. So out of fear for their family, they moved to Philippines. Of course, if you're any student of history, you know that December 7th, Pearl Harbor, December 8th, they invaded the Philippine Islands. Well, lucky for Peggy and her siblings, in 1940, Peggy went to college back in the United States, and the two other siblings came back to go to boarding school for the children to get an American education. And Mom and Dad moved to Manila, where they established a church called Hopevale. and at its height had over 100 members. The story doesn't go well for them. The Japanese invaded. They ended up rounding up all of the members of that church and beheading them. Peggy hears of this in the United States as she's in college and is obviously very, very angered by the whole thing. Back to that story in a minute. Third story, Jacob DeShazer. Jacob DeShazer was a man who came out of high school, didn't really have anything that he wanted to do, joined the Army as a mechanic. He became a bomber mechanic, and then later was trained to be a bombardier in a B-25 Mitchell. They asked one day if anybody would like to volunteer for a top secret mission from which they assumed most would not return, and Jacob DeShazer signed up for that. That was the Doolittle raid, the raid on Tokyo, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, if you're familiar with that book. And they took off from the aircraft carrier Hornet. 16 planes took off. DeShazer's plane was number 16. Out of all of the people who flew in that mission, of course, you remember none of the planes landed successfully, but remarkably, only a few were captured. There were six people who were captured by the Japanese, and they all came from DeShazer's plane. One was immediately executed. One was executed later. One starved to death later. And DeShazer was taken to a prison camp where he was starved, beaten, tortured, and kept in solitary confinement for 40 months. Back to Fuchida. Fuchida, when he was at his war crimes trial, he was walking up the steps to the courthouse where he was going to testify, and a Japanese man handed him a tract in the Japanese language. And it was the story of an American pilot who in Japanese occupation had been given a Bible and had studied the Bible and turned his life over to Christ and had moved to Kyoto, Japan to be a missionary. That man's name was Jacob DeShazer, the pilot who was shot down on the Doolittle raid. Fuchida thought this was a very interesting story, but put it in his pocket, didn't think much more about it. After the war trials, he was consequently not incarcerated. He wasn't charged for anything. But he had a reunion shortly after that with a bunch of his pilots that had been shot down, and he did not realize they had even survived the war, but they had been in a concentration camp, a prisoner of war camp in Utah, specifically for the Japanese. And they told stories about how when they were at this prisoner of war camp in Utah, they were ministered to by a young woman who was so loving and so kind and taught them about Jesus Christ, and her name was Peggy Covell. Fuchida was so inspired by the story of Peggy Covell, remembered the flyer that he had about Jacob DeShazer, drove across to Kyoto, Japan, which was just a little bit from Tokyo, and he met with DeShazer. And DeShazer, this man who, incidentally, I did not know this, in the Tokyo raid they actually bombed 2 cities. There were 3 planes that bombed Kyoto. One of those planes was DeShazer. DeShazer is now a missionary in Kyoto, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, and one day at his door, Fuchida knocks on his door and says, "I want to know what you know." Fuchida becomes a Christian, moves to California, establishes a church for Japanese-speaking people who were living in California. DeShazer and Fuchida ended up going on a speaking circuit all around the world for several years together, talking about how the love of Christ had bridged their differences. In at least 2 of these 3 lives, you can say that these were the darkest moments they could have known. Peggy Covell hears words that her parents and all of the people that she loved and knew back in that little town were executed by the very Japanese that she gave her life to then go serve. Jacob DeShazer, a hardened man by all admission, a person who absolutely hated the Japanese up until the time that he knew about Christ, is so moved by the love of Christ that he takes the darkest chapter of his life, 40 solid months of torture, to go back and minister to those very people. And Fuchida, the man who is so infamous for one of the most, infamous days in American history, has the love of Christ change him in some profound ways. God works His will in the most absolute darkest moments to do the most absolutely amazing things. I would hazard a guess that on that day that Peggy Covell heard about her parents, you would never have convinced her of what she was going to do with her life, nor Fuchida, nor DeShazer. If you were to ask Habakkuk at the end of chapter 3 what God was going to do in this dark chapter in their country's history, he couldn't have possibly imagined what was on the horizon. We're in chapter 3 of the book of Habakkuk. If you want to join me, I know this is a bit of a reading. We're going to go through it very quickly, but I do want you to have this reading in front of you, and then we're going to unpack a little bit and bring that light to the end. Chapter 3 begins, a prayer of the prophet Habakkuk according to something that I don't know how to say. Lord, I have heard the report about you. Lord, I stand in awe of your deeds. Revive your work in these years. Make it known in these years. In your wrath, remember mercy. God comes from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and his earth is full of his praise. His brilliance is like the light, rays flashing from his hand. This is where his power is hidden. Verses 1, 2, 3, and 4, praise. Praise to God. Praise for this wonderful God that we serve. 5 through the rest is punishment. It goes before him. Pestilence follows in his step. Ahead of him goes plague. Behind him comes pestilence. He stands and shakes the earth. He looks and startles the nations. The age-old mountains break apart. The ancient hills sink down. His pathways are ancient. I see the tents of Cushan in distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian tremble. Are you angry at the rivers, Lord? Is your wrath against the rivers, or in your rage against the seas? When you ride on your horses, your victorious chariots? You took the sheath from your bow. Your arrows are ready to be used with an oath. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains see you and shudder. A downpour of water sweeps by. Its deep roars with its voice and lifts its waves high. The sun and moon stand still in their lofty residence at the flash of your flying arrows. At your brightness and your shining spear, you march across the earth with indignation. You trample down the nations in wrath. You come out to save your people, to save your anointed. You crush the leader of the house with the wicked, and you strip him foot to neck. You notice here in verse 13, there's a definitive shift for just one little moment. For just one little moment, he says, I know that you're going to punish these bad people. I know that. You pierce his head with his own spears. His warriors storm out to scatter us, gloating as if to secretly devour the weak. You tread up the sea with your horses. Verses 6 through 15 are punishment. Verses 1 through 5 are praise. Verses 16 through 19, he remembers promises. I heard and I trembled within. My lips quivered at the sound. Rottenness entered my bones. I trembled where I stood. Now I must quietly wait for the day of distress to come against the people invading us. For the fig tree does not bud, and there's no fruit in the vines, and the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no fruit, though the flocks disappear from the pen, and there are no herds in the stalls. Yet I will celebrate in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. My strength, and he makes my feet like those of a deer, enables me to walk on the mountain heights. This is a really profound roller coaster of a chapter. He starts with praise. He shifts to punishment. He inserts one little verse that talks about, I know you're going to punish the people who are the punishers. And then he ends it with what seems like hopelessness. No fig, no fruit, no olive, no food, no sheep, no herd. And yet, will I still celebrate you? I think if we were to diagnose Habakkuk today, he may very well be manic depressive. The poor guy, he just had a run. And I think any of us in this situation probably would be as well. You know, when we look at chapter 3 in light of the entire book, when we look at chapter 3 in light of everything that we've covered to this point, and I'm just going to give you a really quick review of this, and I'm going to tell you, I know we're going to just fly through a bunch of stuff today. Partly that's because I've had too much caffeine and I'm way too excited about this topic. Partly it is, there's just a lot to get here, and I'm just going to try to jam it in as fast as I can because it really is important for us to get a big picture of how this book is going to come to conclusion. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, Habakkuk begins this whole book by saying, my people are a mess. Everything's bad. The people are bad, the government's bad, the courts are bad, the rules are bad, it's just everywhere's a mess. And he's saying in essence, God, you need to fix this. And God comes back in verses 5 through 11 and says, yes, I am going to fix it, but not the way you think. The way I'm going to fix it is called punishment, it's called discipline, it's called correction. It's going to be harsh, it's going to be severe, it's going to really, really rock your world, dude. Verses 12 through 17, he's going to have Habakkuk going back to God and saying, whoa, wait a minute. Those are bad people. We're bad people, but those are really bad people. And you're going to use really, really bad people to punish just bad people? That doesn't sound right. He even appeals to God's character. That doesn't sound like you. What are you doing? You're not being you. You're not being who you're supposed to be. There's a couple of verses scattered through here that I think give hints to what we find in chapter 3, verse 17. In chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, he says things like, I will wait for God. In chapter 2, verse 4, he says, I will look by faith. He's saying, he doesn't know it yet, but he's actually saying something that's going to be an important New Testament principle. Live by faith and not by sight. He's going to come back at the beginning of chapter 1. And he's going to make this phrase, in your wrath, remember your mercy. Yeah. Bad things are going to happen to his people. And then bad things are going to happen to the punishers of his people. But through it all, there's just this little tiny subtle thread that you have to look really close for, where he says, even when everything's going bad, I know who you are. God, I know who you are. And I know you're bringing wrath, but I know you're a God of mercy. I know who you are. I know that you're doing things that don't make sense to me, but I know you're greater than I am. So I'm going to live by faith, not by what I see. I'm not going to judge you, God, based on what I see. I'm going to judge, you're not going to judge God, but I'm going to know you, God, based on who you are. What we have here are little hints of something he could not possibly have understood the depth of. He couldn't possibly understand the depths of depravity his nation had fallen to, the scope of the punishment that they were about to experience. But even more than that, what he could not fully have understood, what he couldn't have even begun to grasp, is the true virtue of God through all of this. I often, talk about the 828 principle. You've heard me say, I wonder how God's going to 828 this. I can't wait to see God 828 this. I'm going to watch and see how God 828s this. It's become just such a common thing around our congregation for us to talk that way to each other. In fact, somebody not too long ago jotted a card in the mail to me, which, by the way, those of you that do that from time to time, I cannot tell you how much that means to me. It is absolutely such an incredible encouragement. I've shared, Joy and I had a conversation about this one time. I keep those. I have a file. I don't know why I was saying that. I don't have time to talk about this. I have a file, and it's a 3-ring binder that has all this stuff. You can't even shut the thing. It's so full. And on the spine of it, it says, when you get sick of church people, read this. And it is stuff you've sent me. Emails, cards, letters. And when I get blue, I go to that book. When I get frustrated at you, I go to that book. And I see how incredibly encouraging and beautiful and wonderful a people you are, and how incredibly blessed I am to be a part of it. 828, God has taken dark moments in my time here and brought such good out of it. I've seen him do that, and I know the encouragement that comes from the kind things that you say. I say all that to say, when I got a card recently, somebody had written in there, God's going to 828 this. And I was like, yes, he is. I have no idea how. But yes, he is. Here's what you don't know from the book, okay? Here's what's not written in this book. Here's what we don't see, what Habakkuk doesn't know, what Habakkuk cannot know, and without a lot of study and putting together stuff from the other books in the Bible and from Israelite history, you can't know either. But there are some amazing things that God's going to do in this intervening period. Now, just spoiler alert, I'm sure you know this, but it happened like thousands of years ago, so if you don't know by now, it's not like ruining The Sixth Sense in 1992. Like 5 of you knew what that was, and if you had it ruined for you, you were mad. I was mad. What do you mean he's dead? What? I can't watch this movie now. He could not have known what all they had coming, but the spoiler alert is they do get invaded. And it is absolutely brutal. It is brutal to the point that even nations, heathen, pagan nations, bloodthirsty, nasty nations, looked over there and went, ooh, wow. No, we have no morals, and that's wrong. We have no qualms, and that's bad. That's how bad it was. It was truly, truly horrific. And he couldn't have known that. But he also couldn't have known what God was doing in that. 2 weeks ago, or was it last week? I alluded to this just real briefly in our lesson. I talked about how when you go back and you look at the history of the Babylonian people, especially the volume that's called The Early Years of the Empire, the actual historians of the Babylonian period talk about the invasion of Judah. They talk about deporting the people. They talk about the slaughter. They talk about all this. And I told you that one of the things was commonly their practice in Babylon is, as they took back these deported, exiled people from a different country, they would drag them back, they would plop them into a little city of their own, and they would encourage them to recreate their community, to invest in their culture. They encourage them to speak their... Now, they also put a lot of pressure on them to accept other gods and other stuff too. But they encouraged them to create a little piece of home right here. And so, as I told you last time, most of the inhabitants of Judah were transported to a little place in Babylon called Judahtown. And Judahtown was a little island of Judaism in the middle of pagan Babylon. And it was there that the people were encouraged to speak their language and share their culture and remember their history and practice their religion. And it was there, not in Judea, not in Jerusalem, but it was there that the single greatest revival in the history of the Jewish people took place. It wasn't at the height of Solomon's reign when everything was hunky-dory and great in the world. It wasn't when they had David on the throne, the greatest leader they had or ever would know. No, it was when they were the most broken. It was when they were in exile. It was when they were shattered. It was when they were deported hundreds and hundreds of miles away to a strange land. That great psalm that we know from the Bob Marley song, "By the rivers of Babylon where we lay down and we hung our harps on the willows, and they said, 'Sing of us a song,' and we were so heartbroken we couldn't." It was in that the greatest revival in Jewish history took place. It was amazing. It was absolutely remarkable to look at. It was a spiritual revival unlike anything you could possibly imagine, and it happened hundreds and hundreds of miles away from synagogue. It wasn't at the place spiritual revival is supposed to take place. It was an incredible worship revival. It was an incredible time of worship revival, but it happened hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the place where we associate worship. It wasn't at the temple. They had an incredible theological revival, but it was far, far from their schools and synagogues that they had left. They had an incredible, this is probably the weirdest one, they had an incredible nationalistic identity revival. They became aware of who they were as a people, and they grew in a sense of nationalism way outside of their own nation. It's a remarkable story. The darkest, most horrific moment. In one generation, they had a revival that was unprecedented. 5 generations previous had been decline. Boom! The worst punishment they could imagine, and suddenly there's this enormous revival. 2 weeks ago, I talked to you about words like discipline, consequence, and how in the Bible it's often called correction. We don't like to think of that. But that's exactly what we have here. It wasn't discipline for the sake of discipline just because God was angry and wanted everybody to hurt because He was hurting. You know that expression, hurt people, hurt people? Sometimes we think that God's like that. Sometimes we get this idea that God's like that because we're like that, because I'm like that. Maybe y'all aren't. I'll admit, I'm like that. You hurt me, I want to hurt you. That's what I want to do. So we think, well, I'm like that. That's how I think. That must be how God is. God hurts them because they hurt Him first. That's not it. The consequence they suffered was because God had a direct idea for correction, for the very spiritual, theological, intellectual, worship reform, and nationalistic revival that He had planned for them. But He had to get their attention. He had to break them down to get to that point. In the book of Psalms, Seriously? In the book of Psalms, we have prayer after prayer after prayer that cover every facet of life. Psalms is such an interesting book because you can go through there and at any point in time, wherever you are in your life, you can probably find a psalm that fits with wherever you are. Are you at the highest high? Are you at the place where you feel the most joyful and most content and most peaceful? There's a psalm for that. Are you at a place where you're questioning, you're not sure, you're a little hesitant? There's a psalm for that. Are you down in the lowest depths that you've ever been in your entire life? There's a psalm for that. Do you find yourself in the Psalms? What's cool about the Psalms is even those really, really dark, dank, sad, terrible ones, they all end good. They all end with some statement of hope, except for two. And I have to admit, this isn't my... I can't tell you that I sat down and went through 140-something Psalms this week and read them all. This was actually from what I read about Max Lucado writing about this topic in the Psalms. But according to his research, and I don't have any reason to doubt it, there are two Psalms that don't end with anything good, that don't offer anything positive. They don't end with, everything's terrible, but I know you got this, God. They don't end with, everything's falling down, but I'm trusting in you. They just end with, it starts with, it's terrible, it middles with, it's terrible, it ends with, it's terrible, the end. And that's where it leaves it. One of them is Psalm 88, which if you ever really want to get depressed, jump into that one. That one is, there's nothing rosy. It doesn't offer any hope. It doesn't, remember the first week? I talked to you about how sometimes children are just so angry at you, and they charge at you and they bury their little head in your chest and they beat on you and they scream how angry they are and they hate you and they don't want you and they don't love you and they don't like you. And you just wrap them in your arms with tears running down your face and say, I know. It's kind of Psalm 88. That's the psalmist coming at God, beating him in the chest, screaming and yelling, and God just wrapping his ever-loving arms around him and saying, I know, my child. I know. I'm big enough to handle it. I'm not going to reject you for this. We don't reject our children when we do that. We love them even more because they're real and they're honest and they're sharing with us their heartbreak, and we get down on their level and we experience it with them. And in Psalm 88 and these other Psalms that are like this, God comes down and he's like, I get it. I'm not angry at you. I say all that to say that I want to give us today 4 or 5 lessons that we can take from the book of Habakkuk. Because the reality is you either are, have been recently, or will be in the future in a period where you need this. Because it either is dark, it was recently dark, or it's going to be dark. And I don't mean to be a downer, but I want to be honest, and I'd rather you be equipped when those times come. Psalm 88 and these other Psalms remind me of the first principle that I want to share with you about the book of Habakkuk. And that is an invitation to wrestle with God honestly. And I don't think a lot of Christians get this today. I don't think a lot of Christians get this. I think if we'll be honest with our heart of hearts, deep down inside us, sodium pentothal, lie detector test, I think that we would say, no, in my heart of hearts, I don't think I can really contend with God about what I'm upset about. And yet we have example after example after example after example, and an entire book that we've just got done reading it. It says God's big enough and he can handle it. He invites us to bring our true heartfelt wrestling with God, to come and let him know what's truly on our hearts. I don't know how often you do that. I know I don't do it as often as I'd like to. I know I don't do it as often as I need to. But one of the lessons from the book of Habakkuk is I think we really need to get in our noggins the reality that God invites us to wrestle honestly, to really contend with, to really be honest with our feelings that we have. Second, I think this book teaches us that we can, in those dark times, choose to remember the past. Choose to remember the past experiences we've had with God. We see little hints of that in Habakkuk. We see that woven throughout the Psalms. I know things are bad now, God, but in the past you have. I know things are bad and I don't see you at work and I'm not happy with the way things are going. And frankly, I don't think you're doing a very good job. But in the past, I've known this and experienced this and seen this and felt this. And can I say, I think there's enormous strength in that. I think there's enormous strength in remembering those times in the hard times. Second thing I'd ask you to remember, not only the past experiences of God, the past acts of God, but the character of God. Because there will be in our lives situations where the circumstance in which I am facing right now doesn't line up with what I know to be true about the character of God. This is bad, you're good, something doesn't fit. This is ugly, you're beautiful, something doesn't fit. And I think when we find ourselves in the bad, in the ugly, we need to remember the good and the beautiful that is God's character. I think we need to remember that when we're in those circumstances, when we're in that pit, God is also along with us saying, this does stink. Yes, this is terrible. I'm not happy about this. I am truly convinced, and this is Jeff's opinion, you can have any kind of problem with it you want, you can at me for all I care. But here's my true belief on this, that when we are in our deepest pit, no matter how vehemently and angrily and heartbrokenly we yell at God about what's going on, He's yelling louder because you are His child. As much as something bad happens to me, when I see that happen to my child, how much more am I hurt? We're His children. My friends, we need to remember that's the character of God. He is a loving Father. He does not find joy in our hurt. He finds more hurt in our hurt than we do. All of these have direct correlations to Habakkuk, but a couple of these just pop out off the page in such stark contrast that they have to be looked at directly. Look at verse 18 of chapter 3. Yet I will. If there ever were three words that don't go together in this context, that's it. Bad, 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 bad. Yet I will celebrate. You see, we have this idea that celebration is something that happens when we have cause for it, when we have reason for it, when there's enough circumstances and situations outside of us to merit it. But that's not what Habakkuk says. He says the situations and circumstances are terrible. It doesn't merit anything, but I will choose to celebrate. I tell you, you want to talk about some really, really challenging things to lay on somebody's heart? The reality that I believe wholeheartedly the Bible tells us that joy is as much a choice as it is a circumstance or... No, it's not. Joy is infinitely more a choice than it is any circumstance or situation. It says of Jesus, He went with joy to the cross. That is not a circumstance or situation that brings happiness. But He chose it. He determined it. He selected it. And He acted that way. Habakkuk says, I have no reason to celebrate. Everything I've said prior to this, that word yet is like take all that stuff and then pivot 90 degrees. How is that even possible? Well, it's because of the next three words. I will celebrate in my circumstances. That's lunacy. I will celebrate in my strength. That's stupidity. I will celebrate in my, fill in whatever you want that comes after the word my, and it's stupid. But I will celebrate in the Lord, and suddenly you have a whole new perspective. I can't celebrate what's going on today. I can't celebrate the circumstances and situations I find myself in this moment. But you know what I can celebrate? In the Lord. But you know what I have to do? I've got to choose it. I've got to choose it. It's not something I can just hope happens. It's not something that I can work towards and generate enough willpower to grab it. No, you just have to decide. My eyes are going to lift up from the morass of this world, and they're going to focus on the Lord in whom I have my celebration. Next. Celebrate in the Lord, rejoice in the Lord, the God of my salvation. Verse 19. The Lord, my Lord, is my strength. I don't want to make too much about possessive pronouns, personal pronouns here, but the Lord, my Lord, is my strength. I think there's relationship here. I think that the strength that we can get from the Lord is a strength that's based on the relationship we have with the Lord. Is He your Lord? Then He can be your strength. Is He not your Lord? Then you know what? That's just a far-flung idea that may not necessarily resonate with your heart. But if He's truly your Lord, if He's truly, you are in a relationship with Him, then you have every possible capacity to experience a strength that is His strength. Because He's yours. He's your Lord. And it is a strength you can find in Him when you cannot find in anyone else. You know, when we are at the end of our rope, we need to make sure that we recognize it was our rope. You hear what I'm saying? When we're at the end of our rope, what we're doing is we're looking at it from the standpoint of what is ours. Our circumstance, our situation, our strength, our capacity, what we can do. But that's your rope. God totally negates the whole rope concept because there's no rope long enough for Him to be at the end of. If you're at the end of your rope, it's because it's your rope. You're never at the end of God's rope. God's strength will always be greater than the challenges we find ourselves. Last thing, and I've already alluded to it, I'll just recap it. Live by faith and not by sight. Live by faith and not by sight. Spent way too much time this week looking at faith and faithful. Faith and faithful. Throughout the book of Habakkuk, he uses the word faith and the word faithful a couple of different times. And for the longest time, I just kind of had this idea that faithful just means, faith lived out. And it does. Don't overreact. But there's more to it than just that one is the action of the other. Because what it's really asking us to do is live a faithful life of faith. Faithful has to do with how we implement it. Consistently, resiliently. Faith has to do with the object of that hope, the object of that confidence. And so through the book of Habakkuk, he is constantly being reminded that his life needs to be faithful, continual personal action in light of, and it needs to be a life focused on faith, the object of whom we direct our life. Who is my celebration? Who is my strength? Who is, verse 18, the one in whom I rejoice? Who is, verse 18, my salvation? Well, that's the elements of faith. The elements of faithful is when you get up every morning and you gather your resolve in the strength of the Lord to live that way. Because what we have way too much of in the church today are a bunch of people that have a whole lot of theoretical faith but don't really embody any practical faithfulness. I believe a lot of things, but it doesn't actually change the way I live. I believe the Lord is my strength. I believe the Lord is my salvation. I believe the Lord is my reason for celebration. But I'm living a miserable, unempowered, completely weak and limp, worthless life every single day because I've got faith, but I'm not being faithful. I'm not following through with it. I'm caving in to the sadness. I'm caving in to the circumstances and situations. That's not faithful. Faith, the object. Faithful, living it out. Oh, boy. Okay. If I got to cut, what do I cut? All right. Let me see if I have time for this. Go. Oh, I thought you were going to make one. Yeah. Yeah, that is the challenge, isn't it? If I would stop to take a breath, you guys could have some. There's a song that I've been listening to a lot this week. And it goes like this. They say sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Right now I'm losing bad. I've stood on this stage night after night, reminding the broken to be all right. But right now, I just can't. It's easy to sing when there's nothing to bring me down. But what will I say when I'm held to the flame, like I am right now? And then here's the chorus. He's singing to God. I know you're able, and I know you can. Save through the fire with your mighty hand. But even if you don't, my hope is you alone. I know you're able and I know you can save through the fire with your mighty hand, but even if you don't, my hope is in you alone. I know the sorrow and I know the hurt. I know it would all go away if you would just say the word, but even if you don't, my hope is you alone. Can we live that way? You know what I think? I think Habakkuk is traveling through a journey from not being able to live that way to being able to live that way. Because he says, God, you could fix this. You've told me you won't. You're still my hope. If you had a conversation with God and you could say, God, here's my thing. I need you to do this. I need you to do it just this way. I need this to happen. And he said, no. Could you walk away from that conversation and say, you're my hope. You're my celebration. You're my strength. You see, I believe, hesitantly, stumblingly, staggeringly, Habakkuk has traveled a journey that has arrived at a point where he could say, even if you don't. I don't know that I can say that yet. I don't know where you are on that journey. But I can tell you that destination looks pretty cool. Light at the end of the tunnel. Here we go. I got 2 minutes. I've already told you. One of the greatest nationalistic revivals in the history of the Jewish people. One of the greatest cultural revolutions in the history of the people. One of the greatest theological revivals in the history of the Jewish people. One of the greatest worship reform revivals in the history of the Jewish people. It was a time that was unprecedented in the most unlikely situation. And if the story stopped right there, we could walk out of here and go, whew, God 828'd the biggest mess I can imagine. But that's not even the good stuff. Because you see, what happened was, as there was revival taking place in Judah town and all these little villages of people that were exiled, and they were rediscovering a connection with God, rediscovering a love of the Torah, rediscovering a relationship with each other, a sense of identity, what it meant to be God's people, which don't even get me started on that. That was a whole section I had to cut. God's people. If we could just get our brains around what it means that we are God's people, can you imagine the revival we could have? That's another day. So, all that is great. What we forget in the book of Habakkuk is it wasn't just the stuff happening in Judah town and these little villages that was so cool. Because some of the exiles went to the big cities. Some of the exiles were really smart. Some of the exiles went to become counselors of the kings. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, these guys. They didn't live in Judah town. They didn't live in little fringe outskirts. Were they involved in the revival? I guarantee it. I'm sure of it. I'm confident of it. But that wasn't their main thing. They were working in the palaces. They were working with the elite of society. When you piece together what we read from the book of Daniel, when you piece together what we read from the Old Testament, what you find in history, and what you find in the New Testament, you learn that Daniel, when he was rising to power and prominence, was known as a political figure, a leader, but he was known in his day as a spiritual leader. He set up a school that attracted some of the wisest young people in Babylon, a school that taught the Old Testament, a school that explored the God Yahweh, and talked about a coming Messiah. And long after Daniel was gone, that school continued to develop Jewish scholars of Babylonian descent. These weren't Jews. These were heathen cultures that were so attracted. Peggy Covell and the Japanese prisoners of war. Jacob DeShazer in the middle of a prison. These were heathen people who were attracted to Daniel's message about Yahweh God and the coming Messiah, so much so that for hundreds of years after Daniel was dead, the schools continued. Until one day they popped back up on the scene. Because on that fateful night that Jesus Christ came into the world, there were already wise men on a journey from a faraway land. Wise men that would come bearing gifts. pronouncing a king. Who were those wise men? Where did they come from? Those were Daniel's boys. They had gone to those schools. For hundreds of years, they've been poring over the Scriptures. So that it wasn't King Herod and his throne or the chief priests in their temple courts, but it was some Babylonians, half a world away, who arrived on the scene to say, hey, this is the day we've been waiting for. And it goes back to Daniel, which goes back to the exile, which goes back to a punishment, which I would argue may be one of the greatest cases of 828 and something that we find anywhere in history. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. I did not let you get a word in. I would like to say next week I'll make up for it, but you know I probably won't. It really just depends on how much caffeine I have and how excited I am about the text. So next week we'll pick it up from there, but I'm so grateful for this time with you this morning. Thank you.